Can everybody hear me okay? Perfect. My talk today will be focusing on the nearshore fisheries of Lake Ontario, but the vast majority of what I'm going to be talking about will be centered around the Eastern Basin. Before I get too much further, I want to acknowledge the contributions of Sarah Beach, who provided the data from the Canadian side of the lake, and Mike Connerton, who compiled the Creel survey data for the US side. So because the following data span a broad portion of the lake, I'm just going to touch over where some of our survey data come from. Gill nets are set in the Eastern Basin on both the US and Canadian side of the lake, as well as in the Bay of Quinte. Angler surveys cover the Bay of Quinte, the south shore of Lake Ontario, and most recently New York's Eastern Basin. So the nearshore zone goal is to protect, restore, and sustain the diversity of the nearshore fish community, with an emphasis on self-sustaining native fishes, including walleye, yellow perch, lake sturgeon, smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, sunfish, northern pike, muskellunge, and American eel. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on yellow perch, walleye, and smallmouth bass, with a brief mention of some trends in lake sturgeon towards the end. So within the nearshore zone goal, we have two nearshore zone objectives. I'll focus on the first one, which is to maintain healthy and diverse fisheries, or to maintain, enhance, and restore self-sustaining local populations of the species I mentioned previously. So the status or trend indicator for this FCO is maintaining or increasing fisheries populations and recruitment of those species. First up, I'm going to focus on yellow perch. And once again, since data span a variety of surveys and a variety of locations, I'm just going to start out each section with a map covering which data I'm covering. So the following data are primarily from surveys covering the Eastern Basin and the Bay of Quinte. Additionally, there's commercial netting for yellow perch permitted in Ontario waters east of Brighton, including the Bay of Quinte, East and West Lakes, and the St. Lawrence River. I'll be focusing on Lake Ontario and the Bay of Quinte for the Ontario numbers. Much of the commercial gill netting for yellow perch in New York waters occurs in the Eastern Basin in Chameau Bay. So in 2023, over 69,000 pounds of yellow perch were harvested commercially in Ontario waters, which was a 3.5 decrease from the previous year. Much of this harvest comes from the Bay of Quinte. In New York, commercial harvest was a little over 11,500 pounds, which was a 64% decrease from 2022, but this was due to the fact that only one of the 3 licensed commercial operations ran last year. So looking at CUEs for gill net assessments on the Ontario side, Bay of Quinte, which is shown in the darker gray. The fisheries management plan target for the Bay of Quinte is a catch per unit effort of 114.5, which is shown by the higher dashed bar. In 2023, the CUE of yellow perch was 80.1, which was above the 10-year average of 70. In the Eastern Basin of Ontario, shown below in the lighter gray, the fisheries management plan target for yellow perch is 27.2. In 2023, the CUE of perch was 2.7, which was below the 10-year average of 3.2. In New York's Eastern Basin, which I have shown here contrasting the Eastern Basin of Ontario, there are no management targets for yellow perch. In 2023, the CUE of yellow perch, again in the black, in the Eastern Basin gill net sets of New York was 12.1, which was greater than the 10-year average of 9.1 shown by the dashed bar. So trends in yellow perch abundance from these 3 regions have been fairly consistent or have generally increased over the last 10 years, although the FMP targets for both the Ontario's Eastern Basin and the Bay of Quinte have not recently been met. So next up, I'll just do a quick overview of walleye status and trends. As with perch, I'll start with an overview of the regions our data will cover. So, index netting occurs in the Eastern Basin on both sides of Lake Ontario, as well as within the Bay of Quinte. Additionally, trawling for young of the year walleye occurs in the Bay of Quinte in the fall. In New York's Eastern Basin and the upper and middle Bay of Quinte, angler surveys cover catch and harvest rates of walleye in both the summer and the fall. Unfortunately, walleye are not well represented in the South Shore Angler Survey of the open lake in Lake Ontario, so I won't cover them in that capacity. Commercial harvest of walleye is prohibited in New York waters and is strictly regulated in Ontario waters. Total catch quota for Ontario for walleye is 48,000 pounds in the waters east of Brighton and within the lower Bay of Quinte. Commercial harvest of walleye in the upper and middle Bay of Quinte is prohibited. In 2023, the total commercial harvest of walleye was 19,736 pounds, and most of this harvest occurred in the lower Bay of Quinte. Walleye recruitment is gauged by the catch per trawl of age 0 walleye caught in bottom trawls in the Bay of Quinte in the early fall. Age 0 walleye have generally been meeting Ontario Fisheries Management Plan targets of 2.5. Catches were at or above this target for 6 of the last 10 years. Excellent year classes were produced in the Bay of Quinte in 2008, 2014, and 2015. Good year classes were produced in 2018, 2020, and 2022, and fair year classes were seen in 2021 and 2023. Interesting to note that on the New York side of the Eastern Basin, in our summer gill netting assessment, we typically see these trends reflected in age structures collected through the survey. The excellent year classes of 2014 and 2015 are still making very strong contributions to the age structures we collect each year, while the 2008 class is beginning to taper off and not make up quite as much of the population structure that we see. Similarly, we're also seeing the good year classes of 2020, 2022, and 2018 as well. Starting with Ontario waters, the annual index gill netting catch per unit effort was below Fisheries Management Plan targets in the Bay of Quinte, which was shown above in the dark gray. The FMP target for juvenile walleye caught in the Bay of Quinte during the gill netting assessment is a CUE of 5. The 2023 CUE of walleye here was 2.5, which was also below the 10-year average of 4.4. In the Eastern Basin, shown in the lighter gray, the FMP target for adult walleye is a CUE of 1.75. In 2023, the CUE of adult walleye in the Eastern Basin was 4.9, which was above both the FMP target and the 10-year average of 4.1. So again, contrasting the two sides of the Eastern Basin with the New York side in black. There are no management targets on the New York side for walleye. In 2023, the CUE of all ages of walleye that were caught in Eastern Basin gill net sets was 1.5, which was also equal to the 10-year average shown by the shorter black dashed line. Trends in walleye abundance from these regions have been fairly consistent or have increased for over the last 10 years, although FMP targets in the Bay of Quinte have not recently been met, and the CUE for juvenile walleye has been slightly lower for the past 2 years. We'll take a quick look at walleye catch rates in the Eastern Basin of New York and how they stack up to some other regions. But first, a little bit of background on this survey. This is an access site survey that has been implemented in the past 2 years, spanning between June and November. Creel agents perform trailer counts and interviews on all weekends and holidays, as well as 3 weekdays per week in AM and PM time slots. The survey spans 12 sites and 2 charter marinas between Henderson and Cape Vincent. And from the survey, we're able to gauge catch and harvest rates, angler effort, and size of harvested fish. So in 2023, catch rates of anglers targeting walleye were variable, but were overall higher in the summer and fall, with a season mean of 0.15 walleye caught per angler hour, or hour that an angler spent fishing. A late summer through fall angler diary survey run by OMNRF from 2012 to 2022 found mean catch rates of about 0.17 walleye caught per angler hour. And in 2023, the OMNRF roving creel survey found in the upper and middle bay of Quinte, running between the first Saturday in May through mid-August, had catch rates approximately double that at 0.34 walleye caught per angler hour. The mean catch rates of walleye by anglers targeting walleye between June 15th and the end of September in New York's Eastern Basin for 2023 were lower than the previous iterations of the survey, run in 1998, 2003, and 2022. In other New York waters, catch rates in the 2008 through 2009 St. Lawrence River Creel Survey, which was the last time this survey was performed, were higher at 0.67 walleye caught per angler hour, as were the mean catch rates for the 2013 through 2022 surveys run through Lake Erie and Oneida Lake, which both were about 0.4 walleye caught per angler hour. We'll switch gears once again and look at overall trends and status in smallmouth bass in Lake Ontario. Once again, going to talk about the aerial coverage of the surveys I'll be discussing. So both sides of the eastern basin of Lake Ontario are covered by gillnet assessments. In Ontario, roving angler surveys occur in the upper and middle bay of Quinte, and in New York, angler surveys occurred along the south shore of the main lake, as well as the eastern basin. In Ontario's eastern basin gill netting, the 2023 CUE for bass was 4.42, which was below the 10-year average of 0.59. In both portions of the eastern basin, there are no management targets for smallmouth bass. In New York's gill netting, the 2023 CPUE of smallmouth bass was 7.4, which is above the 10-year average of 6.3. Trends in CUE of smallmouth bass in both sides of the eastern basin have been fairly consistent over recent years. While there's not currently a recruitment index for smallmouth bass in the eastern basin, otoliths collected from the New York Eastern Basin Warm Water Assessment have shown that several year classes comprising larger proportions of the population over the last 5 years, and these were namely the 2016, 2018, and 2020 year classes. Switching back to catch rates now, we'll start with the results from the Bay of Quinte Open Water Roving Creel Survey. 2023 was the third year of the early bass catch and release season, with the regular season now beginning on the first Saturday in July. To get a better estimate of this early catch and release season, OMNR was planning an aerial creel survey census creel census this year, spanning the Bay of Quinte and the Eastern Basin. The mean catch rate of smallmouth bass observed in the upper and middle Bay of Quinte between May 6th and August 11th was approximately 0.17 bass caught per angler hour. Bulk of this effort occurs during the regular season, beginning in July. Approximately 3% of the anglers interviewed in this survey were targeting smallmouth bass. Moving our focus south of the border, I'll introduce New York's Main Lake Fishing Boat Survey, which spans New York's portion of the South Shore from the Niagara River to Henderson. The surveys occurred from April through September since 1985. 2 crews cover the span of the lake with agents out daily. This survey covers weekends, holidays, and half of all weekdays. Angler effort in terms of boat trips in U.S. waters has declined since the 1980s, and since about 2009, the number of boat trips targeting smallmouth bass has been below 10,000. Smallmouth bass catch rates by anglers targeting smallmouth bass in the main lake have been variable over the last 40 years. Despite the noted decline in boat trips, ranging from a low of 0.34 bass caught per angler hour in 2010 to 2 bass caught per angler hour in 2002. Catch rates have been consistently lower in the past decade, but in the past few years have increased again. Harvest rates have also been consistently lower than catch rates across the full time series. Focusing again on the Eastern Basin Creel Survey, which has been conducted 7 times since the 1960s, approximately once per decade until the past 2 years. Mean catch rates in the Eastern Basin ranged from 0.5 bass caught an angler hour up to 1.3 bass, or 0.5 bass caught per angler hour in 2003, up to 1.3 bass caught per angler hour in 1978. In more recent years, catch rates have improved compared to the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Compared to other U.S. waters, the average catch rates in the Eastern Basin are similar to those estimated by the Lake Ontario Open Lake Survey in 2022, higher than the mean rate of smallmouth bass caught in the St. Lawrence River in 2009, as well as Oneida Lake in 2022. Smallmouth bass catch rates in Erie were higher in 2022 at about 1.1 bass caught per angler hour, but these rates have fluctuated between 0.86 and 1.1 bass caught per angler hour over the past 5 years. All of these locations are considered to have excellent bass fishing quality, and bass fishing in the Eastern Basin, especially in the past 2 years, has been as good or better than other waters known for their bass fishing quality. Broken down month by month, with the exception of the closed season in May, smallmouth bass make up the majority of fishing effort in New York's Eastern Basin in most months, or approximately 57% of the total effort. So, briefly going to describe some trends in lake sturgeon catches in New York's Eastern Basin, and bring up the second fisheries community objective that I mentioned earlier. So FCO 1.2 is to restore lake sturgeon populations, increase the abundance of naturally produced lake sturgeon to levels that would support sustainable fisheries. And the status or trend indicator that would support this is increasing abundance of lake sturgeon within the next 20 years. In 2023, the CPUE of lake sturgeon caught in New York's Eastern Basin warm water gill netting was the highest on record, with about 0.84 sturgeon per net, well above the 10-year average of 0.273. Of the sturgeon caught and checked for coated wire tags in 2023, 78% were of hatchery origin. So to tie everything together and wrap things up, overall, breaking it down species by species, we've generally seen consistent or stable trends or some increase in numbers of perch, walleye, and smallmouth bass in New York and Ontario waters. So things have kind of maintained the status quo over the past 10 years. With that, I'm just going to wrap up and I'll take any questions.